Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Susan Coffin at Attitude Magazine. We are very pleased today to have Chris Zeigler Dendy with us. Chris is an expert on ADD at school. She's probably one of the leading writers and thinkers on this topic. She's been an educator, a school psychologist, and mental health professional for over 40 years, and is the author of a number of books one of which I want to underline to you, which is called Teaching Teens with ADD, ADHD, and Executive Function Deficits. Chris points out that book, although it's named Teaching Teens, does have very practical tips for kids as young as 8 years old. Chris has a website also, chrisdendy.com, and on that website you'll find her upcoming talks. So with that, let me turn it over to Chris, and thank you again, Chris, for taking the time to do this webinar today.
Well, hello there. I'm delighted to join you today. My husband is also sitting in today. The title of our session is How to Overcome ADHD and Executive Function Deficits, and I think a better word might be how to learn to cope and compensate for those challenges. I'm going to just lay a brief foundation for you. ADHD, ADD are can be very complex for many children. And if your child is struggling in school, then chances are the challenges are complex. I have resources on my website. I have books. We have DVDs, and I'll talk about more of those later. And of course, I'll be speaking 5 or 6 times between now and the end of the year, and I'll tell you about that near the end. The point number one that I believe is on your screen, I can't see it, but collaboration is key. I think you know that. One of the first things I always check for when a child is struggling is how their medication levels are, if they're high enough, because we know from research that it's often too low for peak academic performance. We'll also, you should know that up to 50% of our children have learning disabilities, so sometimes they're overlooked because we only look at the ADHD. So trust your guts is always my basic instruction to parents. If your child is struggling and you feel like something is going on, talk with your teacher. And last but not least, you need to learn everything you can about ADHD so that you know how to cope with it. The second point is understanding the ADHD research. The main point here is that our children's brains are delayed in maturity, and one researcher puts that around 3 years. So your 12-year-old may act more like an 8.5-year-old, and that's a point that teachers often don't understand. So they're saying he should be able to remember his homework, but the problem is, yes, his birthday makes him 12, but his maturation makes him 8.5. So that's why we as parents often intuitively know that these children need more supervision. Another point to make here that I found out recently is that the reward center of the brain has reduced chemistry there. The neurotransmitters, the kids have fewer. So, for example, that to me explains why children can do easy materials, can play video games and other activities like read Auto Week, but have difficulty with harder work. And the point here is that they lack enough brain chemistry, the higher energy that they need in order to focus on difficult materials. And it's critical for parents and teachers to understand that. Educating yourself is critical, especially about executive function. I'm sure we'll talk more about that today. Is that one of the key characteristics of executive function is getting started. Have you ever wondered why you get your child trapped at the kitchen table and lo and behold, he can't get started on his work? Well, that is an executive skill. It's not laziness. Working memory is critical. It's very limited, though. That's why you can tell them 2 or 3 things, and that's all they can remember. They also have problems analyzing and problem solving. That's why writing essays is difficult, why complex math is difficult. That's why our children have problems with reading comprehension. They read something and then they can't remember what they read because they have a smaller memory capacity. They have problems organizing and planning ahead. You also need to recognize the common learning problems our children have so you can be on the lookout to get needed support. Written expression, one study says 65% of our children have difficulties with that. Complex math like algebra, reading comprehension. And how many of you have struggled night after night to try to help your child learn their multiplication tables? Well, they can memorize, but they lack strategies, so you need to help teach them those. And many of those are outlined in my Teaching Teens book. Slow processing speed is also a problem. Homework takes longer for these children, and these are the children who need shorter assignments. If they're spending more than 2 hours on homework at night, something is wrong. Now, if you have questions after we're done, you can email me, and I'll try to come up with an answer for you. But this is something that really needs attention. Common reasons for school failure, and often executive function deficits are the culprit here. They forget their homework. They make a lot of zeros. And those are characteristics of the ADHD, particularly the executive function deficit. They have problems completing long-term projects. And I always say to parents, you need to identify this in an IEP or 504 plan that you will be notified in advance about a long-term project. Two challenges here. One is the impaired sense of time and feeling overwhelmed. The middle school, our kids hit a brick wall, and that's because of executive function deficits. So I want to help you today learn how to be a detective, how to gather data that's going to help you with your child, and also to be sure and educate yourself through our website, the articles there. If you email me, I can send you some handouts on 10 key facts and also share with you our speaking events. We'll be in Houston next month, the following month, Dallas in July, Birmingham in South Carolina, and then in Detroit in September, and D.C. with Chad in November. So that's my long-winded summary.
If I may start with a question about executive function disorder, can you clarify for our listeners how is it a separate issue from ADD? Is it an intrinsic part of it? How would you describe it? And the subtext to this question is that some people on the webinar have reported that their schools have said that because their child has executive function disorder, that they don't have ADD, they don't need an IEP or 504. What is the relationship between the two, and how are they seen by schools, or should they be seen by schools?
Well, executive functions are critically important, and schools can't afford to ignore them. Different researchers have different perspectives, but I'll tell you what Dr. Barkley says, because I think that's probably, in my experience, I think it's probably true. Up to 90% of our children with ADHD also have executive function deficits. Now, that's a neurological issue. In the new revisions to the Section 504 regulations, they specifically mention neurological problems as a component or a condition that is eligible for support. So I do have a summary on those new amendments to the law, ADA and Section 504, and that's another one I would be glad to share with you. But basically what you're looking at with executive function is I felt my son was gifted, and I felt his problems were more related to the executive function deficits. He had trouble getting started. He had trouble remembering, the working memory issue, remembering to bring home his homework assignment. He had trouble with long-term projects. He forgot them. And often on a Thursday night at 7 o'clock, he'd say, "Oh, by the way, Mom, my semester chemistry project is due tomorrow." So that's why you really want to make sure that that is incorporated in part of your IEP or 504 plan. And, the other thing that's kind of interesting is self-talk is part of ADHD. And many of us have good self-talk. In other words, about 30 minutes ago, a messenger in your brain kind of talked to you and said, you have this webinar in 30 minutes, so you need to go, get ready, sign on, do all the things you need to do. Well, we know that the children's self-talk is delayed, and it's not as active as yours and mine. So I call that an internal reminder system. They get messages. Their brain says, you have homework, you have a long-term project. Well, their brains don't always say that, so you have to give them external prompts. You know, a verbal reminder, an auditory reminder, a Post-it note, an alarm that reminds them about what they need to do. And the other key thing I think is important to educate your child. And what you do, I say something like this to Alex. Alex, people with ADHD have trouble getting started, and I know that's hard for you. I'm doing two things. One, I'm acknowledging and educating him about ADHD so he doesn't get the internalized sense that he's lazy. And then the second thing is I give him two choices of a way that we could handle this together. I want him to be a partner with me in this. Sometimes it's hard to do that when they're very young, but certainly by the time they reach mid-elementary school, you want them to have a chance to be a partner with you.
One of the questions that's come up here frequently, I'm seeing 4 or 5 questions along these lines, is parents asking what they can do to help their child improve their organization skills. You know, there are parents on the webinar who are saying that they're at the end of their rope, they're exhausted, they're frantic because of their children's losing papers, forgetting assignments, and they really would like to know what can they best do to help their child make progress in learning organization skills. And secondarily, is that something that they should be asking the school to help with? Should that be part of a IEP or a 504 plan?
Yes, to your last question. I would definitely try to include that in the IEP and the 504 plan. The first thing I would want parents to recognize is this is not laziness and being obstinate or obnoxious. This is a key part, an executive skill that's a critical part of ADHD, and that's why they need supports. And you've got to remember that your 12-year-old is more like an 8.5-year-old. So you can structure things at home. One of the things, like having a place for him to do homework, having things in open baskets or clear baskets, and have a set time, but you give him a choice. Would you like to start at 7 or 7:05? That's kind of a joke. You know, you're giving them a choice, but it's not really a choice. But at school, they can either help in a couple of ways, like a planner, organizer. Sometimes our children won't use them. They forget to use them. One of the things you can do is ask that a friend perhaps write down the assignment and give it to him in case he forgets. Or I also like the notion of row captains. The teacher gives the assignment. The teacher has her row captains go down each row, and they look at Alex's place and say, Alex, you haven't written down your assignment. Write it right here. So that's an external prompt that reminds him to do it. You can sometimes help them organize their locker to develop a system. Any book you have homework in, put on the bottom shelf. Of course, I used to have wonderful ideas, but Alex wouldn't use about half of them. So you need to get over the fact you may make a suggestion and they may reject it, but that's got to be okay. Sometimes, too, you can check the teacher website, and that will give you pointers about what their homework is. Or you can have them text message home themselves to say what their homework is. Kids love gadgets, so if you can find a way to use gadgets, that often helps. Now, I know one young man whose father was a professor at Georgia Tech, wouldn't use his planner, but his dad printed up some cards. So he wrote on the card what his homework was, and he put it in his pocket. Now, that doesn't follow the traditional planner line, but if you can find something that works. One child folded their unfinished math paper, put it in his book, and that was his visual cue that he had homework there. One girl wrote the assignment in her palm. Of course, that gets washed and that can fade, but anything wild and wacky is going to be more effective than, just same and similar. Another thing I really encourage you to do is never throw any completed papers away. I would sit down and go through with my child his folder each week because they're overwhelmed by that kind of thing. Pull out and save any papers and help him organize it. So there are really no magic answers to this. Sometimes, well, I guess that's really a homework tip, so I'll hold that.
No, I think homework is very much on people's minds, and part of the question about organizing skills does relate to doing homework, remembering assignments, and especially bringing homework in. So many people have written that their child does the homework but doesn't turn it in, and therefore doesn't get credit for having done it, or does it only 90% of the way and doesn't complete it. So yeah, I think transitioning to discussing homework would be great.
Okay. One of the things you can do is, I like the idea. I think Patricia Quinn and her folks in that office came up with the idea of a launching pad. At the end of the homework assignment, you make sure you go in and you make sure that your child puts all his homework back in, that he puts it in his backpack, and you put it at your point of exit. For us, it was the back door, so that it's a visual cue, or a table by the back door, so that you can see the backpack and you don't forget it. So those kind of visual cues are important. Number one, there are about 17 ways that homework can go wrong. You've got to remember you have a homework assignment. You have to remember what it is. You have to bring home the right books. So you have to kind of work out a plan for each of those points. One of the ways to make sure the homework assignment gets home, again, is the row captain. Make sure that they go down the row. We also had a phone number for for a child in each class, so that he forgot his homework, and we also knew where they lived in case we had to go borrow a book from them. Or what I said to Alex at some point, as long as you're passing, I'll leave you alone. But if you're in danger of failing or you're struggling, then I will be involved. And so I make sure he's started, I drop in on him, or I fold laundry in the room with him, or he's in the kitchen working and I'm washing dishes. And so that then I can make sure, I check it. But, I'll say as soon as you're passing again and you're doing all your homework and turning it in, then I won't bother you anymore. But, you've got to remember the 3-year delay. Their brain is continuing to mature. It does get better. It reaches peak maturation in the 30s and the 40s. You also have a big jump around the late teens. So I'm sorry the news isn't better than that. You're dealing with a situation that you have and then looking forward to it getting better, especially as they get older. Sometimes, since your child has trouble starting, you need to jump start them. And some ways that you can do that is because, remember, getting started is an executive skill and they have problems. So maybe you sit down with them and you make sure they're started, because the teens that are featured in our ADHD video, Real Life ADHD, that say once they get started, they were fine. But I talked with a student the other day, and after we were through, she said, I'm so glad you told me these things because now I understand myself better. And with understanding comes a way of learning to cope. You learn that you can take charge and you can cope, because ultimately being independent is the thing that you really want to ensure. Of course, in the old days, I had to laugh. We would have to go to the school and hope that somebody left the door open so that we could get his books. Or one teacher actually printed up the homework and taped it to a window facing out. So we would be standing around outside the window with a flashlight trying to read the assignments. But sometimes if there's a student that he'll work well with, and they will actually work, having a buddy come over. I guess those are the main things, but you want to have structure and routine for homework time. But break it into segments. You must realize that brain breaks are good, because when you sit too long, your water level, like the glucose and the blood flow is delayed. So either having them drink water or eat a brain snack like raisins, or have a fidget toy, those kinds of things, or I hate to say it, but chewing gum, all of those things kind of help, or laughter, taking a break. Let's go outside and shoot 3 baskets. All those things increase the blood flow to the brain and help them focus better. I do also have a sheet on homework tips for parents that is probably too long, but you can cut it down to use only the key points.
Can you just briefly say some of the key points? That I think, is it the same place every day, the same time? Are you an advocate of a specific amount of time, whether you finished or not, or how do parents handle that, that issue of?
I like the set time. The routine and structure are critical, but don't ask them to do it right after school, typically for me. They are so stressed. Their brain has worked so hard just to do what other kids do. They have to work harder. They have to think harder. So, yes, same structure, same place. If they want to hear music as long as it doesn't seem to distract them, they actually seem to do a little better, with some music that's maybe lower key or not a lot of words, so they're going to be tempted to sing along with it. But you had another part to that question, and it kind of left me. What was remaining on your question?
Well, sometimes people say, the homework time should be whatever, an hour from 3 whatever time, and the child should stay there for that amount of time, so to discourage, getting it done and then quickly and sloppily and racing off, that sort of thing.
Well, personally, school is such torture for some of our children. I never did that. If he didn't have homework, I would say, wonderful, assuming I could trust what he was telling me about not having homework, and use it for family time, use it for physical activity, because often our children's successes come outside of school with sports or art, and all of those things are helpful. Help me one more time with the remainder of what you were saying there. I tend to have
I think
working.
You've answered it. That's really helpful. A couple of folks on the list on the webinar whose children are somewhat older have said that their children are very resistant to any help from their parents. Get angry, say back off, I can do it myself, and yet they really can't. But they feel that their children feel that they're being treated as a young child, and their parents are concerned about how they're going to survive, without the skills that they clearly need help with. Do you have any advice for dealing with resistant teens?
Resistance is a problem for many of our children. That's why I think it's so critical to start ADHD education early. That's why we wrote our book, Bird's Eye View, because we feel like children can hear other teenagers, and that book is very reader-friendly and has advice from teens to give each other. Plus, so many of the things I've developed were things that we needed when our child was a teenager but didn't have. That's why we did our Real Life ADHD video DVD, because the kids were, they're 30 teenagers, and they give advice about how they coped with things. But, I was pretty adamant. If you are failing, I will be involved. As long as you're passing, you're fine. But I did that all the way through, so it was kind of an expectation. We talk about our kids hitting a brick wall in middle school, and that's because the demands for executive skills, getting started, working independently, kind of expand exponentially. In elementary school, teachers are the working memory. So what I finally accepted is I needed to be involved longer and more than I personally wanted to be, because you must understand, I'm a school psychologist, and so I'm feeling guilty. You're too involved. I'm giving these messages to myself, and I finally said, no, I know my child best. Now, don't go too far. You have to walk such a fine line. You want them to do as much for themselves as they can. You want to be involved as little as possible. You're trying to teach them skills. It's like on long-term projects. They don't know how to schedule backwards. So you have to show them and do it with them. And remember that our children are capable of developing new brain cells, new neurons. So if you teach them enough and work with them enough, it's going to help. And the other thing I learned recently from a neurologist, Dr. Martha Dankwa, is that when our children take medication, it opens them up to the learning experience. And the learning experience helps mature the child's brain. So they have found that children who have been on medication have greater brain maturity than those who haven't. So it's not that the medication does it, but that opens them to the learning experience and enables them to learn and develop more mastery.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it was fascinating to me. She's amazing. Right. And my husband just sent me a note. He said, as long as the grades are okay, you leave them alone. And that was really hard for me because I was a straight A student and I wanted him to be. And you have to recognize your child is not a clone of you. And I reached a point where I would greet him at the door when he came home from school, and rather than say, hi, how are you? How was your day? I'd say, have you got your books and your homework? After a while, I kind of go, Chris, get a grip. You know, your relationship with your child is the most important thing you have. So you must find time to enjoy him. You must find time to find joy with him. Go to a movie. Get him to teach you something you hate, a video game. And by the way, there is a website that analyzes video games and tells you which executive skills it works on. Now, that's not going to be magic, but darn, if they're going to do video games anyway, try to find some academic ones or some of these that are going to at least help develop organization or analysis or whatever.
It's interesting that you say we had just heard on a recent webinar from someone who also advised allow your child to teach you something, whatever it is that is important to them, as a way to forge a relationship and not always be the person who's directing and giving advice and so forth.
Our children are often very intuitive, and when we send them constant negative message, you need to get started, you didn't do that, your room is terrible, da-da-da-da-da, then that's all they hear all day long. You need to be sure you are positive with, genuine praise and things like helping them be successful and honoring them for the strengths they have. I'm very big on a strength-based approach.
Okay, makes sense. To one of your points about hitting the wall at 8th grade, there are 3 or 4 or more maybe posters here whose kids, they're very concerned about the transition to high school. Their kids are very disorganized and yet they're very bright, and they're coasting their way through and not acknowledging that they need changes, and they're very concerned about what's going to happen when they make that transition to high school. Do you have any advice for those parents?
Well, I think the transition to middle school is probably just maybe even a bigger hurdle than the transition to high school.
Yeah.
But, you have to figure out, identify the specifics of where is my child struggling. If he's forgetting to bring his books home after school because he's so disorganized and forgetful, one woman hired a senior to meet her daughter at the locker and to make sure she had all her books. Now, some schools will put that in the IEP and will, have an aide who is involved. But I think you have to remember how overloaded teachers are. And as much as you can do for yourself and for your child, then that's an important, track to take. So what else with that issue? I don't feel like I addressed it.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Just turning to a different subject that's come up here. Some parents are asking about what kind of school is best for a child with ADD. So specifically, one person's asking about has a choice between a traditional setting or a technology-based, more hands-on school. which is more project-based and school-based and group-based. And they're wondering, is that a good thing for an ADHD child where they can move around more, or are those distractions going to make it more difficult? Is there a general rule of thumb? It may not be. I know each child being so different, but.
Well, generally speaking, we know that hands-on activities are better for our children. They learn more effectively that way. We looked at a private school when our child was struggling, but I found out they didn't understand ADHD. It was kind of a college prep. So in many instances, if you can get this public school to work with you, that's a fantastic way to go, because you have certain rights under the law, and you really need to make it a point to learn what the laws provide. For example, your child does not have to have if they have high grades, they aren't necessarily ineligible for services. If they're passing, if they're getting a lot of support from you at home and structure, if they're on medication, they can't use that against the child to say you're not eligible. A lot of schools don't understand that. I do a lot of training nationally for teachers. I just had over 200 folks in a session with me in South Carolina about a week ago. And, they write me and say, oh, I understand now. Thanks so much for this. So helping educate the teacher is key. If you have a one-page fact sheet, sending that to the teacher, and you do it in little pieces, because most teachers think they know everything there is to know about ADHD, but there isn't.
Yeah. That's a good idea. Maybe we should create a fact sheet that people can hand out to their relatives or teachers or an educational. I mean, we do have some, but maybe one specifically for school. Do you have any advice for parents who are just frazzled? I mean, the number of people who posted today who said they're exhausted, they need help, they're just, I'm sort of at a loss just as to what to say. They feel that they simply can't keep up with the needs of their child. I mean, some of them are saying they have ADD themselves.
Yes.
How is a parent supposed to take care of herself and also her child?
One of the ways I did that is I was a member, actually helped start a CHAD group in Atlanta, because what I find is those support groups, and you have at a southern region in the Texas area, and these parents all have kids with ADHD, and you can tell them things that you can't tell your own parents, because parents sometimes don't mean to, but they say, well, if you would just discipline him more, you wouldn't have this problem, and the implication is it's your problem. So I had a mentor. She had a daughter a little older than mine, and I would call her in Ohio, and I would cry sometimes, and I would say, you're not going to believe what he's done now. He got 2 speeding tickets in the same day, and I was just exhausted. And she laughed, and she said, you know what? My daughter got a DUI last year. And we just sit there and laugh at the absurdity of it. And then she explains the girl had a beer or something, backed out of the driveway, hit a mailbox. The policeman came and said, have you been drinking? She says, yes, sir. So it's like our kids get caught if they do something. And, of course, it's exhausting. You have to find some time for you. I mean, again, the most important thing, if you're educated, then you know what's going on with your child, and you understand it better. And, and sometimes the difficult thing is educating your spouse, because parents sometimes don't agree. That's why my husband is such a wonderful asset, because he talks at most all of our presentations. And he was a graduate of the Naval Academy, so you can imagine how he felt about discipline. So we help fathers and parents. We also have a DVD, it's actually a VHS tape, but we're working on our DVD, turning it into a DVD that's strictly for fathers. And our bird's eye view, one college professor uses it as a book for parents when he does parent education on ADHD. So, be good to yourself, try to find some downtime, or whatever makes you feel better, if it's music, if it's exercise. Exercise is key, both for you and the kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's an interesting question from someone who asks whether you think that ADD coaches can play a helpful role for children or for parents.
Well, I do. You have to find the right one. This young woman that I talked to is going off to college, and I helped line her up. I tend to prefer if you can at least have a face-to-face for a while to establish a relationship. And the EDGE Foundation, particularly when your children are going off to college, are kind of aware of coaches who are involved with students, particularly as they transition. And you must also remember that when your child goes to college, to back up a step, if your child is going to college and you think they will struggle because obviously you're not going to be there to provide as many supports, then you need to make certain you have an IEP or 504 plan by the end of their senior year. Because when our children are eligible under Section 504 in college for extra supports, just like in high school, extended time, early registration, pick of the teachers, note takers, those kinds of things. But you have to have documentation. And if you've had an IEP or 504 plan, then that helps you with the documentation. So
I think,
coaches are good, yes.
Okay.
But again, I did help this young woman find a coach, and they're going down to meet them this week, and so they're happy about that.
That's great. Are there assisted technologies that you recommend or that you've seen work well for kids with executive function deficits?
Well, I guess one of the things the computer is often the best help you can have. Sometimes because our kids' handwriting is usually awful. They sometimes can't read it. They have slow processing speed. They have trouble getting their ideas down on paper, so a computer is often helpful. There are other things like a timer, to help remind you of something. Sometimes there's a software called Dragon Speaking Naturally. I believe that's what it's called, that you can dictate to. In the past, in earlier years, I know some people have had problems with that. I feel, off the top of my head, I'm having a little trouble coming up with all the ones that I usually recommend. I'm kind of skimming to see if I can find it.
I do think a number of people have mentioned this, and you mentioned it also. I do think that iPads and iPhones are really helpful, and iTouches I know my daughter is in college, keeps everything on her phone. Of course, there's also the problem of losing the phone, which just happened this week.
True. Your cell phone is great. Use it as a tool for reminder. With regard to medicine, I put Alex's medicine when he was in high school in a clear plastic container and put it on the table by his plate. It's a visual reminder. And so then I can go and peek, and if he hasn't taken it, I don't say anything. I just hand it to him. Because after a while, you get tired of someone nagging you and saying, have you taken your medicine? So try to stay away from that. I know, I used to joke back in the days when women took hormones more. If I skipped my hormones one day, I wouldn't want my husband asking me if I'd had my hormones that day, because it just puts you in an awful mood. One other helpful tool is some sort of timer, because you have to remember that time is abstract. And so if you can make it concrete, there's something called a time timer. Yes, they also have software you can put on your computer, and it counts time backwards, and it has a red kind of slat that shows as time decreases. Our kids have an impaired sense of time, and so, for example, if I ask you to tell me when 10 seconds is up, you could probably tell me, but our kids have no sense of that, so they feel overwhelmed. This is going to take forever. And so if you can help them see that it doesn't, then that can be helpful. Some kids also like something like a watch minder, although there are a lot of others, I'm sure, just regular watches that will give you a reminder of where you need to be when. In the old days, I asked Alex for permission, and if he would be on a date, I would text him and say, it's 11 o'clock or whatever it was when he was supposed to be home. But I had his permission to do that. In other words, Alex, people with ADHD have an impaired sense of time.
Right.
What I'd like to do is text you at the right time. Or the other trick I had in college, I would call him and say, good luck on your test tomorrow. I had a copy of his, I had asked for a copy of his syllabus. So what I was really doing, and you laughed, so you know, I was reminding him he had a test tomorrow.
Absolutely, right.
But you have to become a master of being sneaky. I mean, that's an awful thing to say. But it's like you're always scrambling to find a way to help your child.
Right.
Without
intruding on their space. Right.
Yeah, and without them feeling devalued.
Exactly. There's an interesting question here from Larry on behalf of the teachers of children with ADD and ADHD. What are some real strategies that teachers can use to help the children in their classes who have ADD and ADHD?
All right. I, again, try to use, I have, if I can find them, a list of teaching strategies. One is providing external cues, visual cues, like you can use something called visual posting. In other words, if you're trying to remember what the key components of a certain science issue are, you post them. You post them on the board, and then you practice verbally going over them. It's like step one in this process is this, and you say step one is this, and they repeat the answer to you. Modeling helps. Guided lecture notes help because you have to remember they have limited working memory capacity, and so they have trouble, and it's very hard for them to take notes. You can also help teach them note-taking skills, but if they can't manage all that, if they haven't reached a point of mastery, then you need to appoint a note-taker, and that's done you might have one person take notes, print them off, put them in a box. Of course, then somebody's got to remind your teen with ADHD to get those. Graphic organizers are good. Those are sheets, like when Alex was writing essays, you have the key steps on there of how to write an essay so that he can use his limited working memory capacity to write the essay. Use of color, highlighting in color, putting words on cards, so the verbs are on the red cards and the nouns are on the blue cards. So there are things in a magazine called Really Good Stuff, Visuals, Desktop Helpers, that has for younger kids the multiplication tables on it so that they can see it and figure it out, and then just through practice they will learn them more. The brain breaks I really recommend. There are things like machine gun feet where you have them run in place, jumping jacks. I often have teachers dance to music. In fact, I enjoy it, and it wakes them all up. There is a book called Energizers that gives you tips, brain breaks that you can use, using a stand-up desk, having 2 workstations so that he can get up and move in between assignments like he does his language arts, and then when he's finished, he can move to the back, or put him on the end of the row so that when he's wiggling, he can sit with his knees in his desk or stand behind his chair or kneel, and it's not disturbing to the other students. Things like fidget toys that you can hold in your hand. There are things called tangles or fidgets. So those are some of the main kinds of things.
Well, okay, those are great suggestions. Here's a person, this is an issue that we talked about before the webinar started, who's saying, I still don't understand if ADD and executive function are separate disorders or the same. Can you give a little more information on that?
Well, again, there's not a simple answer because experts can't even agree exactly what executive function is. But what I see is that all kids with ADHD, Tourette, conditions that have a neurological basis can have executive function deficits. So it's not just ADHD. The other thing we know about ADHD is it seldom occurs alone. Over 70% of our kids have something else. Could be a learning disability, could be anxiety, could be depression. So if your child is on medication and he's still struggling, you need to be finding out what the coexisting condition is. So it's like something is going on with the brain chemistry that is contributing to the ADHD, the neurotransmitters. Something is going on with the executive skills, and it all overlaps. Barkley argues that maybe we really should be calling ADHD executive function deficit, or more of that related title. But more and more people are understanding this is not a behavior disorder. And in fact, in the DSM-5, the new diagnostic criteria for ADHD are included in the same category with learning disabilities and Asperger's and some of the others, because it's a significant developmental delay. It's not, they're not mentally challenged in any way. It's just that it's harder, that school activities are so much harder. But the key is to keep their self-esteem intact and then help guide them into a career where they're not shackled by having to use, to rely on their deficits, because for kids in school, ADHD characteristics are awful. It makes it hard, very hard.
There are a number of people here who, just to back up a second, want to know the name of the website that you mentioned that evaluates video games. If you remember it.
It's called Learning. It's one word, of course. Learning Works for Kids. The 4 is spelled out. It's not a number. Learning Works for Kids. Now, I'm always careful. I don't like to recommend things unless I know for a fact that it works. I know that the people who developed this are highly respected researchers in our field, but don't expect this to be a magic bullet. It won't be. But if kids are going to play executive, they've only, in the real world, they've only had modest generalization from this. I'm a research person, so it can't hurt. So that's kind of, I know the other thing they added, talk during and after the game, discuss strategies, and try to look for parallels to academics. Oh, yeah, this is what you have to do when you write an essay. So that added component helps make the video games more effective. So that's why you're going to have to bite the bullet and learn how to play some of these video games with him so that he can feel really good and you can feel really inadequate. And then you're going to know exactly how he feels in the classroom.
Okay. Turning to IEPs and 504s, people, number of questions about any advice you have for specific accommodations to request for ADD and ADHD kids. That's part one. And part two is, what's the best way to cope with a school that just doesn't see a need to give your child any accommodations, even though, because they're doing well academically, even though they clearly have ADD or ADHD?
Well, the accommodations we used most, because Alex had the slow processing speed. All right, let me, the two-part is 504 and then how to deal with schools. I've got to
I'm sorry.
That. No, that's all right. I will share with you in the group that 10 years ago I had chemotherapy for breast cancer, and what I discovered, you've heard people speak of chemo brain, but what it does is it caused me to have symptoms of ADHD. So for the first time, I understood truly how Alex felt, and plus it also hits your executive skills. So, I have a better understanding of that, and most kids with ADHD don't do well with two-part questions. So that's why I had to write down 504 in schools so I'd remember the topic. All right. With regard to accommodations, one of the most helpful for him would have been things like a note taker. to ask for the guided lecture notes, to particularly identifying the long-term projects in the IEP or 504 plan, and that you would be notified when they occur. Alex had slow processing speed, so extra time. When he would forget his assignments, we use weekly reports. And what I tried to get them to do was accept his late work until we could work on a plan to make the late work go away. In other words, you can't just say, oh my goodness, my child has ADHD, his work is going to be late, just accept it and grade it at a better level. But you need to, in the first part of an IEP, you always identify what the issues are. So you need everything you identify there then has to be addressed with accommodations. However, in my Teaching Teens book, I list a lot of accommodations. And one mom went in and plopped down that whole list and said, I want all of these. Well, you need to be realistic. I would pick the 2 or 3 most important deficits and then pick the 2 or 3 accommodations that match those. In other words, if you have a problem, you want something specifically that's going to address that problem. So that's how I see accommodations, because chances are if you have too many, they're going to be overwhelmed, and the teachers, you're not going to be on their list of favorite parents.
Right.
With regards to working with schools, I find I always try to be very positive. My school system here was somewhat, didn't understand some of the things about ADHD and 504. But I'm in a unique position. I offered free teacher training. If you have someone in your community who understands that, then offer a seminar. See if you can but make sure they're good and accurate. Consider trying to do a PTA program. Give your teachers 1 or 2, one at a time, 1-page handouts. Find an ally at school. And often in every school, with a 10% prevalence rate, there's going to be a teacher who understands ADHD. I call the voice of reasons. You go to them and see if they will be willing to talk to your teacher to try to help them. Some people have connections. If you know the superintendent or the board, ask them to bring in somebody to do ADHD training. Do all you can on your end. When you go to the IEP or whatever, you see what they're doing and you say, this is what I'm going to do at home. So they know you can't expect them to do it all. It's impossible. But I think those are the main points that come to me.
That's great. Yeah, makes sense. I'm just going to end where we're sort of running out of time here with a question from Julie. And we've sort of talked around this, but it's come up so frequently in this particular webinar and others that I thought we'd go back to it. And she asks, how does a parent know what the difference is between providing help for their child's lack of skills and, versus when it's time to just back off and let their child experience the consequences and not sort of serving as an enabler. And I think she's asking this for herself, but I know from others who have been on webinars that parents are frequently accused by relatives, spouses, people at the school of being enablers. How's the parent, is that a risk? And how does the parent know what the difference is between?
Well, I personally don't like the negative use of enabling. Somewhere along the line, years back, in the alcohol arena, they started using enabling as a derogatory comment. I see enabling as positive. That means making things possible. And I think that's what we as parents do. And, I struggle with this because as a professional, my mental health counseling background was saying, you're too involved, you need to back off, you need to let him fail. Well, guess what? He failed a class, went to summer school. You've got to remember that traditional consequences don't work as well with our children. So that next fall, he was right back where he was before. You can't expect a reward or consequence, 6 months, 3 months away from the event to make a difference to the kid. So what works better is a weekly report so that, but Alex, I'll only do that on classes that you're failing. And then as long as you get a good report, I'll back off and you're on your own again. But if he missed homework, on Friday, he knew that he wasn't going to the mall or wherever. The teacher would email what his missing assignments were, and he would have to do those. So the message now is if you don't do your homework, the message is don't do your homework and you'll never have to do it, and that's a reward. So for him, I had him do it. But you've got to be realistic. If it's 3 hours of homework, you can't do it all at one sitting. And the other thing is if they're taking medications, don't expect them to do homework without medication. We did that for years, and that's one of the things my husband says he really regrets because we were anxious about the medication. So he's going to be able to focus better and to complete it. So you've got to remember, a 12-year-old is more like an 8-year-old. An 18-year-old is more like a 13-year-old. Our kids are going to need more supervision. And what I say in my sessions, if a teacher said, you're too involved, then here's what I would say to her. Well, as you know, researchers say that our children have a 30% developmental delay in their brain maturation. And what I need to do is provide him developmentally appropriate supervision. He may be 12 chronologically, but developmentally he's 8.5. And don't feel guilty about providing support. But again, don't do it for him. Try to make the accommodations and support that will help him do it on his own. And as he gets more mature, he'll be able to do more. But that providing developmentally appropriate supervision, that's why I do that. I take that one-page fact, 10 key facts, and, I point to the one that says 3-year brain delay, developmental, Barclay translates that into about a 30%. So, but again, the fine line is the tough thing because, and what I also find, and also what Dankla said, is that we're teaching our skills, before teachers are teaching skills before they are mature enough to learn them. And I always get tickled. The middle school teachers are preparing our kids for high school. Elementary are preparing them for middle school. And heck, our kids are barely able to do elementary work sometimes in elementary school. So let them be, an elementary student. But, educate yourself, be confident in what you say, and, but again, the fine line.
Chris, we're right up at 2 o'clock, so it's time to finish up. And do you have any last general comments that you'd like to share with the group?
Well, enjoy your child, treasure your relationship, keep it strong. We almost lost one of our kids to suicide, and I think the only thing, my son looked at me after he lost his driver's license and his girlfriend broke up with me, and he says, I would like to just go to sleep and never wake up, and if it weren't for the fact that I know how badly it was hurting you, I couldn't do it. So, excuse me, just keep in mind above all else that your relationship with your child is the most important thing. Keep it positive.
Thank you, Chris, so much for your time. Remember chrisdendy.com and chris@chrisdendy.com email address. Thank you all very much and have a good weekend.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.